Excellent. So welcome everyone. It's so good to see you like this in person, a bit hybrid, joining us online. Welcome to the very first ever session of Questions About Music, which is a new series that is really is a new series of talks and conversation. And the idea is getting together as a department to discuss things that make us curious about music, really anything and everything that, when it comes to music, make us curious. An occasion to come together as a department, academics, performer, doesn't matter if you're a music theorist, a musicologist, an ethnomusicologist, if you play the trombone, the tuba, we want a choral conductor. The whole idea is that we want to come together and talk about what is it that we like, about music, what question we have, even when we like something very much. And it's wonderful to see familiar faces, and if we haven't met yet, make sure to come at the end and tell me what you're curious about, and we could see doing a session like this about something else. It could be about very small things, about a single recording, about a single score, about a very big question: is music healthy? Is music intrinsically political? There is space for a lot in this kind of platform, so don't hesitate to get in touch about that. So, my name is Fabio Morabito. I'm part of the academic faculty here in the Department of Music at the U of A, and my job is that of a music historian, which means that I am interested in what kind of stories people tell about music, why they tell them, and how they do that. And that's why I was all too intrigued when I found out that my colleague here, Dr. Tim Shantz, who is our director of choirs, but also leads a beautiful choral conducting graduate program, he was setting up a ginormous project with basically everyone in the department possibly involved to perform the Michael Haydn's Requiem in C minor. And this is a project that involves 4 choirs, is that correct? Of various contingencies, also from a different campus of the U of A, the Agostana campus, and so it's the kind of project that has the orchestra, everyone playing, learning an instrument involved, everyone singing, people doing choral conducting involved. It's the kind of project that if you go in these weeks in the Fine Arts Building, you can listen even the walls singing more stupefit. And so I thought this is the sort of kind of project that makes a big contingent of people curious about this piece, about the composer. So why not ask a number of questions about it, about what this music is about, or why does it sound the way it does? Who was Michael Haydn? Why do we know more about Joseph Haydn, his brother, than Michael, for example? And many other questions. So with this in mind, I've invited probably the world expert on Michael Haydn, which is joining us remotely from the San Francisco Conservatory. This is Dr. Eric Arenas, who is a faculty member there. He teaches music history and literature at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And Eric received his PhD in musicology from Stanford University, where he completed a whole PhD dissertation on Michael Haydn. That's why I'm saying he's the expert. And not just on Michael Haydn, but also on the practice of concerted church music in 18th century Vienna and Salzburg. His work focuses on 18th and 19th century music history, but particularly sacred and orchestral genre, patronage, cultural context in Austria. It's really there is not another definition for the man of the hour. You know, if we wanted someone to ask question about this piece, Eric in the world is probably the best person to answer our question. So why don't we just start off, Eric? And maybe I could start off by asking you the most basic question of all, is like, who is Michael Haydn? Who was Michael Haydn? And why did you get interested in working on him for your PhD thesis? Which, you know, for some people in the room is very clear. PhD takes a long time, and it's an investment of energy, nights and nights and nights of reading, of travels in different countries to do archival work. So Tell us how your passion on Michael Haydn started off. And welcome.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I am completely flattered by that introduction. And I'll just let you know that it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you about this, especially because I, over the past few years, I've been busy teaching and have not been able to do as much with my Michael Haydn research as I would like. So there's a lot on the back burner right now, and so I'm very happy to be able to bring it onto the front burner for this hour at least. So thanks very, very much. To begin with the question of who Michael Haydn was, I'll start at the starting place that just about everybody has, which is that Michael Haydn, or Johann Michael Haydn, to give you his full name, was, of course, the brother of Joseph Haydn, lesser known in history than Joseph Haydn, of course. And to address the question, at least to address the question of why Michael Haydn has fascinated me since I was a graduate student, it has to do with the fact that he is a character in music history, or a personage who is lesser known, but still right in the middle of everything in the late 18th century. So he's the brother of Joseph Haydn. He's a very accomplished and respected composer. His professional life is spent working for a great deal of its time alongside the Mozarts. So a co-worker of Leopold Mozart and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in Salzburg. So he has these connections with the two pillars of classical era music. And I have to admit that I came to him through a fascination with genres like the Mass, because the Mass is really the best example of a genre that is sustained throughout Western music history, from the medieval period to the 20th century. And I love studying continuities. And it fascinates me that the same text or same texts is set by composer after composer, generation to generation, under different circumstances, but still united by certain commonalities, and then of course influenced by continuous traditions and pressures on the genre. So when I first had to decide what I wanted to spend all of my months and years of dissertation research on, I had first turned to Mozart, because I had thought, well, there hasn't been very much written on Mozart's masses that I think are really is authoritative and wide-ranging. And I very quickly, in studying Mozart's masses, and there is quite a bit written there, and they're very well known, but I realized that there are these other figures in the landscape around Mozart, and Michael Haydn loomed very large on it. And I started to realize, well, there are questions about Mozart's masses that I can't really answer until I know much more about Michael Haydn, or at least knowing about Michael Haydn would help me to have a stronger grip on Mozart's accomplishments in this genre. And I quickly realized that there was much work that needed to be done on Michael Haydn. And there are certainly other Michael Haydn experts, so to speak, in the world. So I wouldn't put myself on any pedestal there, but his masses had not been written about in quite a while, and not in a very thorough way. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that much of it had not been available, much had not been published up to that, up to about the 90s, the 1990s. But when I was writing my dissertation back around the 2010s, it was a great time to take another look at Michael Haydn, because so many more of his works were being published, edited and published by the choral conductors in Europe mainly. And I realized, oh, it's available. We can look at these more closely. But there was still a lot to do, and a lot that I was interested in doing, because I really love the detective work, the archaeology of music research. And so I was still able to do that because what was missing, and arguably is still lacking because there's so much context to cover, uh, is the sense of where Michael Haydn came from. And that is where or what shaped his style and his career, because and this all rests with the music of mid 18th century Vienna, and very little is studied about this context and the composers within it. And it's compelling also because this is the same context from which Joseph Haydn arose.
Yeah,
So,
maybe this is a good time to talk a bit about the brothers. Maybe you could tell us a bit more. Why do you think that we know more about Joseph Haydn these days compared to Michael? What characterized the two careers of these two brothers, or how did they both start? Did they all start singing in the choir?
yes, great. The good place to start addressing the who. So, Michael Haydn followed a very similar path to his brother. They were both from a small town in the east of Austria, near Hungary, in a part of Austria called Lower Austria, and they were both recruited, Joseph Haydn first, by the director of the choir at the cathedral, St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. And we know much more about Joseph Haydn because he has been written about much more certainly, but we do know that Michael Haydn followed him a few years later to Vienna. So they started in the same place, and their careers began similarly also. Both left the choir school when they got to the age at which they could no longer be boy singers. And so they both had to fend for themselves in Vienna in a kind of freelance situation for a while. And then both of them landed jobs with lower members, you might say, of the nobility or lower princes. Uh, but that here begins the big distinction. Joseph Haydn got a job with a count, a Bohemian count, but Michael Haydn got a job with a prince bishop. And so from that moment on, Michael Haydn's career ended up staying in the ecclesiastical world. So he worked for ecclesiastical nobility, whereas his brother then went on to work for the glamorous Esterházy court in Hungary. Michael made his way to Salzburg and worked at the uh, venerable court of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. And in the end, Michael Haydn's achievements were mainly related to his work as a composer of church music. And even though he achieved a great deal of success and was perhaps, well, he would have been the best known composer to come out of Salzburg if he hadn't been working alongside of Mozart. Um, uh, so he is not better known because his impact then was not quite the same in the field of opera, and he wrote operas or symphonies, and he wrote symphonies, and they're very good works, that they're quite overshadowed.
Yeah, and it's not that he didn't compose these works, but in a way we have the ecclesiastical Haydn and the more worldly Haydn, and we, for the sort of ways in which the stories of Western music are normally told, we tend to, the people that work just a lot with churches don't necessarily, they didn't have that much of a success in the 19th century, which is a bit the century that made the difference in the way we still tell stories today about this music, or even defines what kind of like gets into our programs today. But is it true that there was an anecdote that someone went to the house of the two Hayds and they said, if you have another brother, another son that sings just as well as Joseph, I'm gonna take him. Is that true?
Yeah, that's the story that is usually written about the beginning, Michael Haydn's beginnings, is that Joseph was doing well in the choir school in Vienna, and the director or the head of music there, a fellow named Georg von Reuter Jr., the second, told his father, if you have, or I'll take any more sons you have who can sing this well. And that we can't confirm that, as with a lot of biographical details, but we do know that he did end up there at the school. And then, interestingly, just continuing with this notion of comparison, it's also written, but we don't know how reliable this is, that at the end of their time in the choir school that Michael Haydn was the one who showed the most promise, or the more promise than his brother. And it's often said of him that he was positioned better and was more educated than Joseph. And that the evidence for that that's given sometimes is that we think he then went to Jesuit school after leaving the
Right.
choir school, rather than just ending up who knows where, playing violin and keyboard like Joseph Haydn.
Yeah, it's incredible because sometimes all our values are flipped. We think that Joseph Haydn had a better job, but in fact, when Joseph Haydn was thinking about retiring, he made an offer to Michael Haydn to be his successor at the court of Esterhazy, and Michael Haydn famously refused. So we need to kind of like try to put ourselves in the shoes of the actual values that were there. He probably was super happy where he was working for the archbishop. So, and maybe this kind of like connects us a bit more into talking about the piece that we have on our table today, the Requiem in C minor. And I actually, among the questions that people were brainstorming, I would love if you could tell us a bit more, why do you think this is a good Requiem? Or why do you think people at the time thought that this might have been a good Requiem in terms of the shape that it has, the length that it has, the sort of like the kind of things that make, why the music sounds the way it does?
Well, I would say that the main quality that makes it a good requiem, so to speak, and by good requiem, I would mean on the one hand, an appropriate requiem, a piece for ceremonial use in its time, but special also because it is still appealing as a concert work. And in that respect, it's similar to Mozart's Requiem, and there is a very important connection between the two. And the reason it makes for a really good liturgical work is because it is built on a principle I've tended to call interhistorical style. And that means that it very clearly reaches to earlier periods of music history while also adapting the modern style to the purposes of the event that it's for. So there is dramatic dramatic writing, arguably, and soloistic writing, but it is above everything a choral piece. So the chorus is at the center of it, and the orchestration supports the choir. And beyond that, it utilizes the Renaissance heritage of polyphonic choral textures in a very prominent way, and that is key for church music composition because the uh, the one thing, to step back from that for a moment, one thing I always stress to my students of 18th century music is that uh, the composers of the generation of Mozart and Haydn, and also the generation before and after them, they didn't know what the classical era was going to be as we know it. But if you had asked them what is classical music, they would have said Renaissance polyphony. And so that was the basis for durable composition in the 18th century, and it was always a living tradition in church music. So a piece like a requiem or a mass would have a heavy amount of counterpoint in it, and that would reflect the Renaissance church music heritage. But it would also incorporate Baroque sounding elements, which would sound to us like anachronistic, perhaps because they're from not from the Renaissance, but from around 1700 or the 1680s. So this you see in the instrumentation, for example, that the heart of the orchestra, for lack of a better description, is really a trio sonata instrumentation. So something like Corelli's works from the
Yeah.
1680s. So it's meant to sound like a bunch of different periods, or no period, or all periods.
Yes.
That's key to the church music style of the time. And then its scope also works in its favor. It's not an hour long or two or an hour and a half long. It's not a work that out overgrows the liturgy. That is, it still fits within a reasonable ceremonial time.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for mentioning this thing. So one of the when you talked about trio sonata, it really came to my mind how much this is a requiem that was supposed to work for the church. So the place for which this requiem was understood was really that kind of institution that had a couple of violins on the payroll all the time, which it's so important that you mentioned Corelli, because it was the same for when Corelli was working in these Roman churches about a century earlier. So, but the point is that the orchestra in the church was around these two violin parts that then for a bigger occasion would be expanded. And maybe this is a perfect occasion to talk about why, how would music that was particularly important in this period would sound important as well? What would people add to the sound? The violins in the church, the two violin parts were a bit the bread and butter. Then we can assume the organ, the choir. This is kind of like what was.
Well, we know it starts with the voices, Fabio.
Yeah.
I have to jump in and say that, the voices, and then of course, the strings and winds instruments really began by mimicking and playing the same kinds of music as the voices, and then expanding from there. So yeah, it is fascinating to think about this. Two violins, no violas, but I think the leading question is, what about the rest of the orchestration here, Dr. Arenas? What is this what makes it more lavish?
Yes. So all very good points. One just little refinement there that I think is worth making is that we're dealing with a church idiom, that trio sound, because the court of Salzburg was the court of a prince archbishop, so he had full enough musical resources that they could perform symphonies. That's just not what they could do that in the church sometimes, so I'll leave that alone for a moment. But those instruments were mainly used in the chamber settings. And they had that, but this is the church idiom, and there's a kind of special sound to me. It's kind of spread out or variegated as a result, because you have at the core that trio sound. So yes, you have organ, continuo, and the violins. And then the next thing, if you're using them, are the trombones, because the trombones are typical features of this kind of music, well, and going back a ways also, because they were always used to double the lower voices. And actually, the use of three trombone parts is specific to Salzburg, because they used a bass trombone, so these doubled the alto, tenor, and bass lines. In other Austrian churches, it was more typical to use tenor and alto trombone and use it on the middle to double the middle lines, and the organ would support the lower line. And in both cases, the violone usually supported the lower line also, or the precursor to the stringed bass. So that's also an important part of the sound, and it seems to have had a very practical reason also, because it helped to fill the space. So to me, that sound of trombones doubling voices is very ecclesiastical, or rather it is, not just to me, it is a very ecclesiastical sound. It is here, and it is also in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, for example, where he uses the same instrumentation, so he would have understood it as an ecclesiastical sound. So you have those are two layers, and then the use of trumpets and drums is a special layer, because if the trumpets and drums at a princely court in this time would only have been used on the most important occasions. There would have been a lot of church music written with just the trio instrumentation in support, with the trombones. There might have been some written with the trio and trombones and organ, but also maybe some oboes or bassoons, and Michael Haydn wrote such a mass as well. But it was only on the most important days of the year that they brought in the trumpets and drums, and so they are very much a signal of the importance of the occasion. And so that also speaks to the fact that this requiem is for a very special occasion, and it was for a special occasion, and that was the death of the Prince Archbishop, Sigismund von Schrattenbach, who had been Haydn's patron to his death in 1771. And so it's interesting to note that, because often in liner notes for the requiem, they'll mention the fact that that Haydn may have had inspiration from the fact that he had a daughter who died before she reached the age of 1 year, who died earlier in 1771. And that may or may not be the case, but whatever it is, this is a princely requiem. It is for the death of a prince, in this case, the Prince Archbishop. And so it's special because even the other occasion on which you would perform this piece in a place like Salzburg was All Souls Day, November 2nd, on which a requiem would be performed. But according to the schedule of liturgy in Salzburg in Haydn's time, that was a third rung feast. And on those feasts, they didn't use the trumpets and drums.
Right. So this, for people living in Salzburg at the time, would have been the sound of a special occasion. So it's interesting for us to think about that. But now that you kind of like walked us through the orchestra and the orchestration, maybe you could tell us a bit more how the instruments were almost spatially organized, kind of like this, how this space was occupied. Because we imagine, I don't know how you people are going to perform it, but I don't think that you're going to make much use of different.
No, but I mean, I should say that we're using the Carus edition, and there is mention of how there probably would have been two organs. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Having a portative smaller organ for the soloists, or the pianists, and then you have the larger organ, perhaps that would double everything else. So yeah, I mean that's the one element that's written in the score. We're not, of course, doing that. We're using one portative. But, and we're, of course, the forces, this is not performance practice in the size of the ensemble at all. When we have 80-some singers and, many violins playing and, larger string grouping.
I mean, it's translating the festive of the 18th
Absolutely.
century into the
Absolutely.
festive of the.
Well,
of
it's also,
2022.
it seems, sorry to go a little off the direction, but it seems that music that can withstand actually lots of different formations as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to hear your, more information about the layout of the organs and this using of the space.
Yes, well, I agree. I mean, I think it's fine to expand it. The music works well for that, and I think it actually works particularly well with this kind of orchestration where you have this feeling of space and of different groups. But as for the actual context, a fascinating part of this is that in Salzburg Cathedral, where this was performed and where all of Michael Haydn's mature masses and Mozart's Salzburg masses were performed, the musicians performing this would have been situated in 4 balconies that were that surrounded what's called the transept, so the crossing at the cathedral. So the sound would have been glorious in the middle of it, with each group, coming from a different direction. But at the same time, it's worth noting that it's not really polychoral music. I mean, you may all know about antiphonal or polychoral music, where there's an intention that it should sound like one choir or a group is answering the other, like music of Gabrieli in Venice. That's one type. In this case, there had been a tradition of that kind of music earlier in the time of Bieber, so back in the 1600s. But that wasn't the case in the time of Mozart and Haydn, but they still used the balconies. And in each balcony, there was an organ. And actually, you can see that now because it's been restored. In Salzburg Cathedral, you'll see that there are the 4 organ galleries around the transept. And I apologize, but I don't remember the disposition precisely. But you would have, for example, had the soloists in one gallery and the strings and organ in another gallery. So certainly you would have had these multiple organs, and then the choral singers in the other gallery or 2 galleries, something like that. And to tell you the truth, they don't, when they perform concerts in Salzburg Cathedral to this day, they don't use the galleries. They do during Mass, but they don't when they have concerts, when they want to fill the whole place up, they'll perform up front. And I realized years ago when I was there on a visit, and I was sitting in the gallery, or the organ loft way in the back with the organist listening to Mozart's Coronation Mass, and I realized then this music was not written to be heard way in the back. And they had to perform it more slowly so that it sounded clear in the back. It's meant to be heard up front where all the important people were.
Yeah, but I was really curious about what you said a moment ago, that this music, it feels like it really accommodates to be played by a variety of forces. But Eric, maybe you could tell us a bit more how this music was supposed to withstand the test of time. I remember you telling me about your work in the archive and noticing that certain church music was played for decades and decades and decades. So maybe we could talk a bit about that.
Oh, sure. It's a good point to keep in mind because when we think about 18th century music, especially, quite often we remember the ephemerality of operas. That they were sometimes performed and then forgotten, and there are many that have been not heard since that time because there was no guarantee that they would be heard, more beyond their first run. And symphonies and chamber music could also have limited longevity. But church music was an institutional concern, and most places like Salzburg Cathedral or the cathedral in Vienna or the court in Vienna, they had a huge collection of church music, and they would look to it quite often. There would not. It wasn't a situation like this, what we always associate with Bach, where the composer needed to write a new mass every week for so long. They performed these big masses quite often, but they had a big library, and so there would be new compositions, there would be old compositions. And when I was researching Michael Haydn's background in Vienna, when I was looking at the masses that had been written and performed in the 1740s and 1750s, I saw this information actually written on the covers of the parts. Somebody in the 1700s was kind enough to write all the performance dates every time they performed it.
Are you doing this? Are you keeping up?
This is how of course, we'll keep track. We'll add it to the list,
Yeah, no, it's a great. I mean, I sing in a church choir also, and sometimes I realize, it would be handy if we wrote down what we did last time we sang this feast, or what have you. But there I found certainly masses that were performed over again over the course of 50 years, and in one case, apparently 100 years, and so a composer like Michael Haydn and even Mozart, I think, would have understood that this music they were writing for church services could be heard for a long time, and perhaps longer than a lot of their other music. And with Haydn and the Requiem, I think that's particularly feasible because requiems weren't written that often, because occasions like the death of a prince only happened when the prince died. And then they would elect a new Prince Archbishop, and he would reign for who knows how long. But before Haydn, I mean, there are other requiem settings in the Salzburg Music Library, and it's clear to me that he looked at some of these earlier examples, and so I think he and I think other composers of the time really thought about the tradition when they wrote these pieces, and getting back to that interhistorical style that I mentioned, that's a key part of this. They look back to see what was effective and what was still appealing and logical for this tradition. And so, for example, getting back to the whole trio sonata issue, the opening sounds like a reminiscent of a Corelli trio sonata, and a particular one I can think of also. But it also sounds like Pergolesi Stabat Mater.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to bring that up to you.
Which sounds like a trio sonata at its beginning. And the Pergolesi Stabat Mater was an immensely well-known piece in the 18th century. And so he was latching on to these traditions and devices he understood as good for making a durable piece of music.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning, the fact that we don't necessarily think about that, but requiems were composed less often because that was not the everyday occasion for the music that was being composed, that needed to be composed in that church, in that court, because the normal fare were masses, and then for the very special occasion you get the requiem. And in this particular case, it's a very important person dying, then you get the requiem with this very special orchestration. But maybe you could I think this is so interesting to hear about this. And
Absolutely.
I think I saw you having an example of the beginning of the Requiem, and next to the beginning of the Stabat Mater by Pergolesi. Did I see wrongly? Do you have the musical example there with you? Could we?
Yeah, I have that on hand if you'd like to hear.
Yeah, why not?
It's a fascinatingly similar. I mean, you can hear, yeah. I mean, Pergolesi's influence is clear, quite broad.
I love how these people were kind of like really looking at their library in a way that it was so special for this period. We tend to expect that much more for the 19th century, the musical museum, or, in a way thinking about Stravinsky, connecting styles that are so different. But within this context of church music, in the late 18th century, that was the done thing, to look at these various styles, just as what Aris was saying a moment ago, and what it did work and what it didn't. So you see a stratification that it really has this flavor of the time of the church idiom, which is what Eric said at the beginning, that fascinates him, of this much longer tradition that goes from the Middle Ages.
This is 40 years later, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite fascinating.
Yeah. Do you have an
I'll add,
example?
oh yes, but I'll just add this one thing to even move it into the 19th century, is that an important thing to also realize is that one of the reasons that early 19th century German music critics like E.T.A. Hoffmann liked the Mozart Requiem was because it sounded like a new Baroque piece. They liked the oldness of it, and the Hoffmann and others had become very critical of what modern church music sounded like, which they thought was too operatic sometimes or too entertaining, and they wanted something serious and old sounding. And so that was a big part of the appeal of the Mozart Requiem, but the same qualities are in the Michael Haydn Requiem, and so it's easy to see how it also remained relevant, although it was only really in Austria that Michael Haydn's Requiem has been performed continuously. But anyhow, let me know if you can't hear these, because I'll first begin with this Corelli. So have a listen to this.
But do share your screen.
Could you hear that well enough?
Beautiful.
Yeah, wonderfully. Yeah.
Yeah, so you hear the walking bass line and the imitative entrances there. And then here's the Pergolesi, the beginning of the Stabat Mater. Okay, I'll stop there, and I'm going to add in one more since I've got this
Oh.
queued up here. Let's see, where did I put it? I think this is it. Just
As you're pulling it up, I mean, I want to mention that, the simplicity of that appoggiatura, these entrances, it's like a simplified Baroque gesture. But it's much more plaintive because it lasts for so long. These extended appoggiaturas, they're.
Yeah, it makes me also think, does it become a topos within church
I
music.
think it's a signifier. I think
Yeah.
it really is. Like it has a meaning. As soon as it's there with the walking bass, and you have these long sustained lines over top that layer, this is, it's saying, it's sort of bowing to something that's been there before, and it has a very specific meaning, right? It's meant to signify. Yeah.
Also, it's telling a story, I think, about what's appropriate in the church realm. So just as you were saying about, yes, as much as the masses of Joseph Haydn and Michael Haydn, there are bits that sound like opera. There's no denying that. And that's also what people wanted to hear, because otherwise maybe it would have been a bit maybe too boring and not fashionable enough. But at the same time, this mixture is what makes this music so special. Eric, did you have another example lined up?
Yes, I wanted to add one thing though to that, which is that that opening gesture is a really wonderful thing for an introit in particular. And this gets back to the idea of the interhistorical style, which is that there are things in it which even reach back to Gregorian chant. And one is the fact that a Gregorian introit usually has a walking character, a processional feeling about it, and that's something that great polyphonic or other settings of introits latch onto, that I think Michael Haydn really got with that one. But here is one further earlier than Haydn example that I thought worthwhile. Anyhow, I just wanted to put that in there because, and that is from Johann Ernst Eberlin's Requiem number 8 in C. And it's one of a couple of moments in that piece that I really think it would be believable that Haydn had dug around in the Salzburg library and found this piece, because there's this, which is part of the Communion, and then part of the Lux Aeterna, which are very reminiscent of this same introit. Then let me just, one other thing here. Let me play this very quickly. Okay, sorry. So that's from the Lacrimosa of that same Requiem, a generation before Michael Haydn's, which also has that some similarities then to what we hear in this. Here's that beginning of Michael Haydn's. sort of
beginning. Yeah. Wow, fantastic. And so in a way, when we think about, when you read the typical liner notes for this piece and you hear that Mozart copied everything from Michael Haydn, it's not a matter of copying here, but it's been actually part of this tradition of music, and Haydn before him, and I've done some work with Luigi Cherubini that has a bit of his second Mezzanonette that sounds just like this.
Right. Yeah.
So it's quite fascinating, but maybe, I can talk on and on, but I wonder if from the side of the performance there are other questions that you would like to ask.
Well, I mean, I wanted to comment too on how he follows tradition in the fugato sections, all the fugues are in the right places, and it really follows the form that was part of the tradition. And yeah, no, I'm struck. Of course, people's ear might be more to hear Mozart's Requiem, so I am struck at how that definitely continues from this tradition, but is expanded. And there's, one thing. It's actually a practical experience is the way he set the sequence. So this part of the text of the Requiem, which begins with a Dies Irae, which is, most people are quite aware of that text, but it's a very long bit of words. And, most other composers, and especially after this period, broke that up into other movements. And even though he gives different character to the verses of that text, I'm very conscious as a conductor, I need to start this in the proper tempo because there's no other place in this long section to change. And even though it has a different character. So I wonder if you could talk about how that's really seems to be done in service of a ceremony rather than concert music.
Oh, certainly. That is part and parcel of the Salzburg style to me. You see this where you have a real serious liturgical music practice where they had to perform pieces like this frequently. It's one thing I've noticed in studying this music in the 18th century. You see this also at the court of Vienna, that the masses that they used frequently were not long 1-hour pieces that are easily turned into concert works, because they meant business. The court went to the cathedral. They had to celebrate a particular feast. There was a necessity there, and in Salzburg they had this tradition for quite a while. So you see this also with the analogous sections of the Mass Ordinary. So in a normal Mass, the Gloria, for example, the setting of the Dies Irae follows some of the same practices that you have in the Gloria, where it's mainly choral, but then you have to break up the monotony of what's otherwise a very declamatory style, because in the Gloria, Glorias are particularly difficult to set. Glorias and Credos, actually, Dies Irae is a little easier because it's more metric, but still, you have to get through a lot of text. There's not going to be a lot of time for big melismatic soloistic writing. The solo parts tend to accentuate the choir, or the choir and soloists will tend to kind of amplify each other or intensify the text so that it's all knit together, as you say, and not into smaller movements, which we tend to call a number mass, where you can break things up into numbers. But like I said, that is typical for a place where they are serious about ceremony, where you tend to find big settings of the Mass where they cut up the longer text into small movements, are places where they actually don't do it that often, where they have a special occasion. We need to use, we have a gala birthday of the prince, so we're going to have a very big Mass, but then those Masses may not be performed again. It's more like a gala opera or an oratorio or something. But indeed, that shows how Michael Haydn's Requiem is meant for use.
Yeah, it's incredible to see sometimes in these archives of church music people obsessing about time. I remember seeing an archive where it's like, this Mass is 41 minutes long, and so on and so forth. This was music for use. It needed to fit a specific space. And there were also other situations in which people could simply cut and pace things, and maybe we don't imagine what could go behind the scene of a performance of a mass like this. We have the score, but we cannot really speak with the musicians of the time and see with what flexibility they were working, perhaps. Do we have any sense of that, Eric?
For which? Could you repeat the last part?
Of the kind of, if there was much flexibility on the performers of the time to deal with this sort of with the score.
Oh, in terms of to alter it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it applies less to the Requiem, but for mass ordinary settings, they would often mix and match movements to fit the time of a ceremony.
Between different masses, but you couldn't really do. But you couldn't really get rid of the credo.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Well, you could on certain occasions.
You could, of course, yeah.
Yeah, according to the liturgy. So that's one thing that is a result of the differentiation between classes of feasts in
Right.
the Catholic liturgy. So there are some masses where they might want to have a big mass with trumpets and drums, but it was an occasion on which the liturgy said you don't have to use a credo, so they would take it out.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one little colorful thing though. There's this type of mass that you see. It's not as prevalent, but just about every composer wrote one where they took the texts of Glorias and Credos and squished them together, so that they could get through a mass very quickly with full instrumentation. And the result is you have this kind of babble texture where you have three different lines of the Credo being sung at the same time.
Wow.
On top of each other, so that the credo.
We just had one of those performed in a grad recital in November here. Of course, Joseph Haydn's famous Saint Ioannis de Deo, this little organ mass,
Right.
which the credo is done, at a blink of an eye. It's quite amazing.
But getting back to Michael Haydn for a second, Michael Haydn wrote a second version of that which stretched those back out.
Okay, I have to find this.
Yeah,
This is
if you
wonderful.
want to do the longer version of that. Maybe this is a good time to ask people to come with their questions, especially people that have been playing this music or singing this music. If you anything that you want to ask Eric, there is a mic right there. Just kind of like walk right up and ask Dr. Arenas whatever you'd like to ask. This is Olivia.
Hi, Dr. Arenas. I'm really enjoying this presentation. It's so nice as a trombonist to be more essential than trumpet players. Love that. Ecclesiastical moment for me. I have a couple questions, I guess, about the notoriety. So whenever I think, of like families within like composition, like throughout music's history, I always think of like the forgotten women, I guess, of the time, like sisters and wives of various very famous canonical composers. Would Michael's relationship with Joseph, would you say it overall improved his notoriety? Did it make it harder for him? I mean, that's kind of a broad question. I'm not sure if it makes sense, but yeah. Well,
it helped him. It didn't. There was no adverse effect on Michael Haydn's reputation, as far as I know. And as we touched on earlier, Joseph did try to help his brother late in life by getting his patron, the Esterházy prince, to offer Michael a job, and there was a particular reason for that, which I won't go into in great detail because it will take a while. But this was in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Things were falling apart in Salzburg after about 1799, and so Michael Haydn was looking around for some other opportunities, and actually went back to Vienna, where he had a following, and the Empress commissioned some works from him. It looks like he might have moved, but then conditions in Salzburg improved, and he decided not to go to the Esterházy court. But that was, one instance in which his brother's fame, would have been an advantage to him. If things had gotten really bad in Salzburg after 1800, he might have picked up with his wife and moved off to the other side of Austria, to Hungary, and lived out his last years there, thanks to his brother.
Can you tell us about C major?
Oh yes, please.
C minor or C minor, just the key of C that we're hanging out in C. It's for our clarinis. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. There's a very good reason for that. Most masses with trumpets and drums were written in C because they wanted to use the trumpets they had. And you see in some locations masses in D because they use D trumpets, but C major was the key for the solemn mass in the late 18th century, and so it's not surprising that that you would have one in C minor, which of course changes things quite a bit. But it's not very common to have a mass like this in another key, except later. So by 1800 or so, there's some kind of change, and trumpet historians would know more about this. It seems like, for example, the court at Vienna bought some new trumpets, and they were able to have more masses in D at that point, and because you have them, because in Michael Haydn's one of his last masses is not in C, and it uses trumpets, and then the final requiem, the requiem he was working on when he died was in B flat. But up to that point, it's all C major. That's what you got.
There's this bunch of masses all in C major, something they call the festive masses, because or solemn masses. The definition of solemn mass with trumpet, the timpani, they had to be in C. But we always think about what it is composed as if it was the decision of the composer. But the Haydn Missa in D minor, the Nelson Mess. People think that, wow, this is without the winds. The winds had been sacked. There was no one at court playing winds. So there was organ and 3 trumpets, hired ad hoc for the occasion. And the prince said yes to that, but not to the whole wind band. Other questions? Yes, jump. Don't be shy.
I feel like I'm at town hall ready to complain about litter and sidewalks. Hello.
And the bike lanes, right?
Yeah, and bike lanes, of course. What was the cultural shift that allowed church, or that made it possible for church music to be extracted and performed in a concert setting? Were people scandalized? Was there a battle back and forth? What happened?
Great question.
Well, that's a good question, because I and other historians of church music always stress this music was written for its function. But yes, it was taken out of that context, and I think it was done so in an informal way at first, like within the scope of Michael Haydn's career. One example of how this happened was that when he wrote these masses for the Empress that I mentioned earlier, the Empress Marie-Thérèse in Vienna in the early 1800s, she was an amateur singer, and she and her brother-in-law and Prince Esterházy at that time were this interesting group of church music connoisseurs. And this is one of the reasons why Michael Haydn almost went to the Esterházy court. But back to Marie-Thérèse, she liked hearing masses, and I think that they performed these masses for the actual church ceremony, but it's known that she enjoyed reading them also and singing the solo parts. He wrote the solo parts for her, and he went and actually heard her sing the solo parts one time, and then took notes for how to write for her the next time, because she wasn't a professional, but they're lovely parts. But I think this, as far as we know, was done in a rehearsal setting, kind of a chamber rehearsal setting. That would never have been done in public. That's just not out of the question, the people coming to hear the Empress sing a church service. But you have other cases of masses being performed in kind of open rehearsals where people would listen to it, and I think there were people who admired the craft of setting this music, but you didn't really have it in concert form. Like even in those places where they had concerts of sacred music, you would sometimes have in mass movements, but the music wasn't composed for this. A pivotal moment in this history is when Mozart's Requiem became popular, so to speak, in Berlin. Because, well, what's the difference between Berlin and Vienna? Well, Berlin is a Protestant city. There's not much interest in performing a requiem in a Catholic requiem mass for any great public occasion. and so it was heard in concert there, and that fed into its uh, uh, popularity, its fame, its prestige over the course of the 19th century. So then, I mean, moving forward, you could then in the 19th century you have more cases of settings of masses and requiems where then the composer seems to have expected this might not be performed in a mass more than once.
Yeah.
And so was really going for the long-term concert future, like that. This is the case with Verdi's Requiem, for example.
Yeah, even the forces of Berlioz's Requiem make me think of a piece that sounds quite well also outside the liturgy, or maybe just outside the liturgy. Do we have questions in the chat by any chance? Just let's double check. Oh,
If there's,
anonymous attendees. Yeah, do you want to?
Okay. An anonymous attendee is asking, thank you for a wonderful presentation and sharing your wisdom, Eric et al.
can't quite see it.
We often feel that Haydn's music is both serious and also humorous, jokester perhaps. My question is directed to Eric. Based on your historio-musical knowledge of Michael Haydn, what are 3 words that you would use to describe the characteristics of his music?
Well, gosh, that's the 3-word issue it makes things a little difficult. I have to use a lot of hyphens. Because I think like the first thing I would think of for describing Michael Haydn's music is well crafted. So I guess you could say thoughtful as one of those words, and another one would be. Well, I mean, it really all I think boils down to that it's thoughtful and appropriate for its occasion, but also just ambitious enough to hold our attention beyond the liturgy, and then the Requiem is the best example for that, because then, like with regard to his masses, more broadly speaking, it's the idea of them being appropriate actually is a double-edged sword, because one thing I argue about his masses more broadly is that the fact that they make such good ceremonial music is what prevents them from being good concert music. So you hear Joseph Haydn's masses in concert because they're big, interesting things and you can focus on just it. But Michael Haydn's music was meant to be heard coming from behind you, basically, while you're watching what's happening at the altar. If not behind you or to the side or somewhere else. It's not to say just the decoration. It's the oral, environment for the music. I mean, for the liturgy. So thoughtful, appropriate. So that's a tough one. So I'm sorry if I can't come up with a good.
One word. No, but I think you described it well. There's something to do with the experience of being there and the aura that this music really creates for that experience. I think you said it really well. It cannot be put in one word. We just decided that. Maybe we have time for one last question. Andrew, you wanted to ask one?
Mm-hmm.
So we had
While Andrew's coming up, or no, no, he's quick.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I was going to ask about some compositional aspects in itself. You've seen in previous works and contemporary works as well, contemporaries at the time, a lot of uses of melisma, sort of elaborating on the melodies in Latin masses and Protestant masses as well, with the work of Bach. The only time that I remember seeing melismas in this work is in the Amen at the end of the Dies Irae, or the Sequentia. Is there we were talking about it being more for the masses to sing. Is that one of the reasons why we don't see as many melismatic passages like we do see later on in more concertized works like like Mozart or Verdi, where you have these long melismatic passages. Is that one of the reasons why we don't see almost any melismas in this work at all?
It's a good question, and it has to do more, I would say, with just that sense of propriety for this kind of church music. There's not a lot of room for much melismatic writing in the Dies Irae, because of the issues we were talking about earlier. There's a lot of text to get through, and if you start to take out one section and set it melismatically, it has to be balanced out in the rest of the piece. So there will have to be other soloistic or melismatic parts. So there just isn't as much room for that. In a massive small scope, your opportunity for more melismatic writing is just like that, and then in Amen, as you point out appropriately, you have room for it then to make this fugato at the end, which is absolutely appropriate for the music. The only other place where you could do that melismatically is in the Kyrie, and it's a typical thing in certain masses of the time where you might set the Christe as a solo. Because you could sing that very melismatically or arioso-like. But yeah, for the scope of a Salzburg, Michael Haydn or Mozart Mass, there just is not a lot of room for melismatic writing because you've got so much text to get through and you don't want to make it an hour and a half long.
Right, the literal time constraints. I mean, 40 minutes tops, right?
Yeah. You seem to have another question before Andrew was coming up.
No, I'm forgetting what it is now.
All right. Yeah. It's okay. Anyone has any final thoughts or final curiosity?
Oh, yeah, now I recall. It was just going to take me a second to remember, but this was performed at Joseph Haydn's funeral, right? This was in honor of when he passed as well. Do you know of other performances around that time? In that period?
No, actually, I do not, unfortunately. That's not something I have dug into. I mean, that's well known that it was used for his funeral, or one of his funeral celebrations.
And at the time, Michael Haydn had already passed away.
Right, yeah.
So Michael died before Joseph, although he was younger.
Yeah. But you certainly wouldn't have had this performed for Michael Haydn's funeral. It's just too princely, Michael. So getting back to the reputation issue, Joseph Haydn was more or less a celebrity in the musical world of the 18th century. And Michael Haydn was a good and respected composer, but he died in Salzburg, still an employee of the court. So they were not going. You wouldn't play the music you would play if the prince died.
Wonderful. Anyone else has any other little curiosity before we yes, just come ahead to the microphone. Running a bit out of time.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation. This question is in line with Andrew's question regarding Dies Irae, and also we know that Dies Irae in Verdi's Requiem, it has a long melisma at the very beginning. Dies Irae, Dies Irae, so there is a long melisma which looks like it was an accepted style, but why was that you said it is because of the heaviness of the text. Dies Irae was not sung in melisma, and related to that, I saw it's not a recent, maybe a little old video in which there was a big budget monstrosity of 300 choir singing Verdi's Requiem. So how big was the choir when this mass was performed for the first time?
That's a good question.
Yes. Well, first of all, yeah, I know that part of the Verdi Requiem well. It's very dramatic and wonderful, but that just would not. I don't think that would have occurred to Michael Haydn. And this gets to a point which I think is worth remembering, which is that Michael Haydn was part of that thoughtful approach. Is that he handled the Latin text very well. Like his setting of the Latin word accents are quite good. and very, you know, Italianate. Uh, and there's, you know, often the tangent comes up when considering masses, you know, like how would they have sung the Latin pronunciation, German or Italian? And I always side towards the Italian because I think they would have sung it in Italian with Italian accent. But it's not absolute, and there would have been places within that generation where that may not have been the case. I think there's just a lot of flexibility there. But they learned their Latin and Italian. But he knows, he understands the rhythm of the text and how to set it elegantly. And that amount of drama stretching out the dies, that just is not the sort of thing he would have done. But it's not the sort of thing that 18th century composers would have done, I think. They would have treated it, again, it comes back to a declamatory style. For long texts, they kind of understood them less as poetry to be set in a dramatic way, but more like a text to be dramatically rendered in some way, more like oratory, not poetry, if you understand the distinction. It's not.
And do we know how many people were in the choir? What sort of forces would have been at the Salzburg Cathedral?
Right. Sorry about forgetting that. It would have been something like, I think, maybe 3 or 4 basses and 3 or 4 tenors, and there might have been 5 or 6 altos and sopranos. And the upper voices would have been sung by the boy choristers, and then the soloists would have been male altos, or they had castrati on the staff, and so we're dealing with a cathedral in the 18th century, so there would not have been women soloists.
So fascinating, yeah. Well, this is wonderful. We are a bit out of time, so I think we should thank Eric. Eric, this has been absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
And we're gonna do an applause. I don't know how much you're gonna hear of it, but here it is. Thank you for being our inaugural guest speaker for this new series, Questions About Music. If you were here, I will bring you to the bar to have a drink. We'll do this next time when traveling is a bit easier. Everyone is invited to join to the bar, but Eric. but I owe you a drink for sure. Let's put it this way.
Okay, well, I'll remember that. But thank you. It was absolutely an honor and a lot of fun, as I said, to bring a lot of my back burner Michael Haydn information back to the front burner for now. I've got now some good ideas that I'd like to continue working out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us, and till next time.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. My best to all of you,
Eric.
and good luck with the performance.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, we should definitely say when the performance is, so that if people here by chance.
That's right. There's many people here involved in the performance, but March 30th we're performing in Camrose. March 30th, it's a 7:30 performance, but it's the second half. And on April 1st at the Windspear. And the first half is the University Symphony Orchestra, of course, performing also a violin concerto. And it's going to be a wonderful first half, and then this is the second half involving the choirs. You said there were 4. There's 3 choirs involved, actually. 3, only 3.
Apologies. Yes. Yes. Wonderful. Well, I hope you can join us for a drink at Dewey's, and we're trying to make this in a thing, the après question about music. And thank you again all for coming. And thank you again, Eric. Bye, Eric.
Bye.